If you were born between 1945 and 1965, stop everything you are doing. Not because something is wrong, because something is finally right. Because the confusion you have carried about why your life has felt like it was building towards something you haven't quite arrived at yet is about to make sense. Because the restlessness, the sense of unfinished business, the feeling that the most important chapter hasn't been written yet, those are not signs of failure. They are signs of exactly who you are and exactly what you came here to do. Carl Jung saw you coming, and what he said about you will change everything. 1. The generation Jung was describing without knowing their birth years. Carl Jung died in 1961. He did not live to see the full flowering of the generation born between 1945 and 1965. He did not use the demographic language of baby boomers or the sociological frameworks that would later be applied to this cohort. But across his decades of clinical work, working with patients at every stage of life, mapping the psychological territory of human development with a precision that nobody before or since has matched, he described this generation, not by name, by psychological profile. He described the specific type of person who arrives at the second half of life, carrying a particular combination of qualities. A life fully lived in the first half, with genuine achievement, genuine relationship, genuine engagement with the world as the world defines success. And then, arriving somewhere in the territory between 50 and 70, a fundamental shift in what the interior is asking for. Not a crisis in the conventional sense, not a breakdown. A breakthrough that feels like a breakdown because the culture has no language for what is actually happening. Jung called this the great question of the second half of life. And for the generation born between 1945 and 1965, who are now between 60 and 80 years old, this question is not approaching. It has arrived. And what Jung said about it, what he understood about the specific spiritual mission that this stage of life is actually asking for, is the most important thing this generation has not yet been told. 2. What the first half of life was actually for. Jung's framework for the human life cycle is built on a distinction that the modern world consistently collapses. The distinction between the work of the first half of life and the work of the second. These are not the same work. They are not even similar work. They require different capacities, different orientations, different relationships with the self and with the world. And confusing them, spending the second half of life doing the work of the first, is, in Jung's framework, one of the most common and most costly mistakes a human being can make. The work of the first half of life is establishment, the building of a viable identity in the external world, the development of the persona, the social self that can navigate the demands of career, relationship, family, community, the accumulation of the practical achievements that make a life function, the career, the home, the partnership, the raising of children, the construction of a place in the social world. This work is real, it is necessary, it deserves genuine investment. And the generation born between 1945 and 1965 did it. Many of them did it extraordinarily well. They built careers that spanned decades, raised families, created financial stability, participated in the social world at every level. They did the work of the first half of life with a seriousness and a commitment that subsequent generations, living in a world of far more fluid identity and far less stable institutional structures, have found genuinely difficult to replicate. But here is what Jung understood, and what the culture conspicuously failed to tell them. The first half of life is preparation, not the destination. Preparation for the destination. The persona that was built, necessary, functional, genuinely achieved, is not the self. It is the container that the self was developing within. The achievements that were accumulated, real, hard-won, genuinely valuable, are not the meaning. They are the platform from which the meaning finally becomes visible. The relationships that were formed, some lasting, some not, all of them instructive, are not the deepest connection available. They are the education in connection that makes the deepest connection possible. Everything the first half produced was not the point. It was the preparation for the point. And the point, Jung was insistent about this across decades of work with people in the second half of life, only becomes accessible when the first half is genuinely complete. 3. The signal that the second half has begun. For many people born between 1945 and 1965, something has already happened. Something that felt, at the time, like loss, like ending, like the beginning of a diminishment they had been dreading. The career that concluded, through retirement, through redundancy, through the natural completion of the work that had organized 30 or 40 years. The children who grew up and built their own lives, leaving a space in the daily structure that had previously been completely full. The relationship that ended, through death, through divorce, through the gradual dissolution of a partnership that had served its season. The health that reminded them, through some significant event, that the body is not infinite and the time is not unlimited. These events are real losses. They deserve to be grieved genuinely. But Jung would not allow them to be only losses, because each of these events, painful as they are, performs a specific and necessary psychological function. They dismantle the structures of the first half. They remove, one by one, the external frameworks that have been organizing the identity, and in removing them, they reveal something that the frameworks were simultaneously supporting and obscuring. The self that was there before the career gave it definition. The self that exists beneath the parental role. The self that persists after the relationship that helped shape it. The self that remains when the health crisis strips away the illusion of unlimited time. This self, revealed by the removal of the first half scaffolding, is not diminished. It is, for the first time, genuinely visible. And the spiritual mission of the second half of life is the exploration and expression of this self. Not the persona self, the real self. The one that was always there, always developing, always moving towards something, but never fully visible while the structures of the first half were in place. 4. What Jung actually meant by spiritual mission, and why it is not what religion taught. When Jung used the word spiritual, and he used it often, carefully, deliberately, he was not using it in the conventional religious sense. He was not describing adherence to doctrine, membership in a community of belief, the performance of prescribed practice. He was describing something more fundamental and more personal than any of these. The encounter with what he called the self. Capital S. Not the ego self, the constructed, managed, socially functional self of the first half. The self, the organizing center of the total psyche. The deep intelligence that underlies consciousness. The part of the human being that is connected not just to the personal history, but to the collective, to the full depth of human experience across all of time. Jung observed, in patient after patient in the second half of life, that this encounter with the self was not optional. It could be delayed, avoided, resisted. But the psyche, which has its own momentum, its own direction, its own commitment to the completion of the life, eventually insists. Through dreams that become impossible to ignore, through symptoms that medicine cannot fully explain, through the persistent, escalating sense of a calling that the busyness of the first half successfully drowned out, but that the comparative quiet of the second half allows to be heard. This calling, which Jung understood as the soul's demand for its own recognition, is what he meant by spiritual mission. Not the mission the world assigns, not the mission the family needs, not the mission that earns income or produces external results, or can be measured by any metric the first half of life considered relevant. The mission that is specific to this individual, this life, this particular configuration of consciousness and experience and unlived potential. The mission that was always there, encoded in the deepest layers of the personality, written in the language of the recurring dream, the unexplained pull, the persistent interest that was never given time, because time was always going to something more immediately necessary. This is the spiritual mission Jung identified for the second half of life. Not universal, deeply, specifically, irreducibly personal, and available, only available, to the person who is willing to stop looking outward for direction and begin listening inward for the instruction that has been present all along. 5. The specific gift of this generation, what they carry that no other generation has. The generation born between 1945 and 1965 carries something that younger generations do not. Not wisdom as a cliché, not experience as a generic asset. Something more specific than either of these. They carry the full weight of the 20th century. They were born in the aftermath of a war that had tested the entire species. They grew up in the Cold War, in the specific, daily awareness that human civilization could end through human decision. They came of age in the social revolutions of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the sexual revolution, the counterculture, forces that genuinely, fundamentally reshaped what human life could mean. They built their adult lives through the economic upheavals of the 1970s and 1980s, through the AIDS crisis, through the fall of the Soviet Union, and the end of the ideological framework that had organized the world for 40 years. They witnessed the birth of the digital age, the internet, the smartphone, the social media transformation that changed what it means to be a human being in relation to other human beings. They have lived through more fundamental change in a single lifetime than any previous generation in human history. And what this produces, in the person who has genuinely metabolized this experience, rather than simply survived it, is a specific and extraordinary kind of wisdom. The wisdom not of theory but of lived reality, of having been tested by genuine upheaval and found, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely, what holds. Jung would call this the wisdom of the individuated self, the understanding that comes not from having had an easy life, but from having been genuinely shaped by a difficult one, and having arrived on the other side at something that the difficulty alone can produce. The knowledge of what matters, not as a philosophical proposition, as a felt, embodied, experientially confirmed reality. This wisdom, specific to this generation, produced by this particular history, is not for them alone. It is the gift they came to bring. 6. The unlived life, and why now is the time. Jung introduced a concept that is particularly alive for this generation. The unlived life, the dreams deferred, the capacities that were developed to the edge of expression and then redirected into the more immediately necessary demands of the first half. The book that was never written because the career demanded all the writing energy. The music that was abandoned because the family needed practical income more than artistic pursuit. The place that called, the country, the landscape, the community, that was visited once and never returned to because life went in a different direction. The relationship with the spirit, however that was understood, however incompletely articulated, that was put aside for later, and later kept receding. The creative impulse, the contemplative impulse, the philosophical impulse, the impulse toward genuine service rather than professional function. All of this, stored, intact, not diminished by the decades of waiting, is what the second half of life is asking for. Not as consolation, not as retirement hobby, not as the comfortable pursuit of someone who has finished the real work, as the real work. Finally, the work that was always the real work but could only be approached after the scaffolding of the first half was complete. Jung was direct about this in his clinical work. The person who arrives at the second half of life and continues doing only the work of the first, continues building, competing, accumulating, performing the persona that the external world rewards, does not find peace, does not find meaning, does not find the thing that the interior has been pointing toward for decades. They find, instead, a specific and painful dissatisfaction. The dissatisfaction of someone who is doing everything right by the standards that organize their life, and finding that those standards no longer produce what they once produced. Not because the standards were wrong, because they were first-half standards, designed for first-half work, and the work has changed. 7. The 4 dimensions of the second-half mission. Jung's understanding of the second-half spiritual mission was not vague. It had specific dimensions, specific orientations, specific qualities of attention and investment that the mission actually requires. The first dimension, the turn inward. The fundamental reorientation of primary attention from the exterior to the interior. Not the abandonment of the exterior, the shift in what is primary. In the first half, the exterior is primary. The career, the relationships, the social world, these are where the investment goes, where the energy flows, where the measure of progress lives. In the second half, Jung observed, the psyche begins, insistently, sometimes urgently, to redirect attention, inward, downward, into the territory that the first half's busyness kept permanently at the periphery. The dream life that is trying to communicate, the interior voices that have been waiting for the noise to reduce, the questions that were deferred through decades of practical necessity, and are now, in the relative quiet, becoming impossible to ignore. The turn inward is not a withdrawal from life, it is a deepening of it. The person who has turned inward, who is in genuine relationship with their own interior, brings something qualitatively different to every external relationship and engagement. A presence, a groundedness, a quality of being genuinely there rather than partially present while monitoring the next demand. The turn inward is the foundation of everything the second half requires. The second dimension, the integration of the shadow. The second half of life is the time when the shadow, the accumulated suppressed material of the first half, comes forward. Not optionally, not as a therapeutic choice, as a developmental necessity. The parts of the personality that were suppressed in order to build the first half identity, the anger that professional life didn't permit, the vulnerability that parental responsibility couldn't afford, the creativity that practical necessity redirected, the spirituality that career demands crowded out. These do not disappear when suppressed. They accumulate. And in the second half of life, when the structures that required their suppression begin to be dismantled, they surface, sometimes gently, as interests that reawaken, as qualities that begin to express themselves in ways that feel surprising and right. Sometimes urgently, as symptoms, as depression that has no obvious external cause, as anxiety that the usual management strategies cannot contain, as the persistent, escalating sense that something is demanding attention that has not been given it. The second half spiritual mission requires the genuine engagement with this material, not its management, its integration, the bringing of what was suppressed into conscious relationship, the acknowledgement of what was denied, the making of room, finally, with the authority that the second half provides, for the full range of what the self actually contains. This integration is not comfortable, it is not quick, but it is the specific work that makes the wisdom of the second half genuinely available. Because the wisdom that comes from integration is categorically different from the knowledge that comes from successful management. Management keeps the shadow in the basement. Integration brings it upstairs. And the person who has genuinely integrated their shadow, who can hold the full complexity of what they are, the darkness and the light, the failure and the capability, the fear and the courage, together, simultaneously, without needing to suppress either. That person has access to an understanding of human experience that no amount of first-half achievement can produce.